I am now switching to English because it's time for me to introduce our first international guest, our first keynote speaker. He is here today to share his experiences and inspire us on how to build a strong grassroots movement. He is a member of the Labour Party Executive Committee, that is partistyrelsen in Swedish, and also the founder of Momentum. I've Googled some articles and you're actually referred to as the Momentum boss. So a warm applause for our friend Jon Lansman.
Hi, really good to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I bring you, of course, solidarity from Britain. We also need your solidarity, by the way. We have a lot of problems of our own. But I want to start with, I was asked to talk about Momentum and the renewal of the Labour Party. And I want to start really where our movement started, which was in the summer of 2015. The summer of hope, of new hope brought by the election of Jeremy Corbyn. But it didn't start that way. When we just lost a general election to the Conservatives again, we had the leadership election started with 4 or 5 candidates who thought that the way to win that election, that leadership election, was to appeal to the neoliberals in the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn, when we started trying to collect the nominations to get him onto the ballot paper for that election, was seen as a no-hoper, someone who did not stand any chance of winning that election, we started the campaign, we booked small halls, and those halls became full. And so we booked bigger halls, and they became full. And in the end, we had to book the biggest halls in the town. And there were some meetings where we filled the hall. I remember one meeting in London where we filled 2 overflow halls, and there were still 500 people in the street. And Jeremy Corbyn spoke to each of the halls and then came out and spoke to the crowds from the top of a fire engine. And so we ran massive phone banks. We'd have hundreds of people every night calling in phone banks around Britain to the people who had a vote. Now that campaign was driven by the rejection of austerity. For the first time in a long while, people heard a message of hope, a message that was different, and it was clear from the very beginning that Jeremy Corbyn was different from other candidates. When he was asked questions, he gave straightforward, honest answers when every other politician avoided the question. That was how he was seen as different, and he inspired hundreds of thousands of people, literally hundreds of thousands, to join the Labour Party. The Labour Party increased in size 3-fold. It became 3 times bigger. For once that summer, when politicians are normally on holiday, the media was positive to the left because it was an exciting thing that was happening. And so that was the story of that summer. But that was not only a rejection of conservative austerity, of the austerity that had blighted the country since the Conservatives were elected in 2010. It was also a rejection of New Labour neoliberalism, the neoliberalism of Blair. But in order to explain how this happened, I have to go back to the beginning of where, in my view, it really started. I want to go back to the 1970s, when I, as a very young man, first joined the Labour Party. It was the start, really, of globalization. There was the oil price shock, a big increase in the price of oil throughout the world. It caused very high inflation. Workers struggled to maintain their real incomes. And really, it represented the failure of Keynesian demand management policies in Britain, and similar things were experienced elsewhere in the advanced economies. It was really in Britain the end of the post-war consensus that had started with the Labour government immediately after the Second World War, which introduced our national health scheme, which introduced our welfare state, which did nationalize many industries for the benefit of the country, the railways, the coal mines, and so on. Now, this was a very difficult time for the economy in Britain. Our industry was in decline. Car production declined. We struggled. The textile industry practically disappeared in response to imports from other countries. So it was a really difficult period. The response of the left at that time was to produce an alternative economic strategy which called for more intervention in the economy, more intervention in industry, to take strategic control of sectors of firms within each sector of the economy, and to reach agreements with other firms in that sector in order to try and regenerate the economy. Unfortunately, that was vetoed by the then leadership of the Labour Party. And the result of that was that there grew a campaign for democracy inside the Labour Party. And that campaign for democracy I would hold up as being very, very crucial. Because the problem we had was that members of parliament were not responsive to the people to the membership, not responsible to their communities and to to workers in the declining industries. And so we campaigned for two things. First of all, we campaigned for open selections of members of parliament. Up to then, members of parliament in a safe Labour seat had a job for life. There was one MP I remember who never went to his constituency for meetings, never did surgeries to meet members of the public who had problems, and yet he could sit on the terrace of the House of Commons and he could look at his constituency on the other side of the river. But there were people, MPs who from other parts of Britain did not have offices in their constituency. Okay, they didn't have the money for staff in those offices. They were very remote. We wanted to select, just as a modest suggestion, once in the lifetime of every parliament, we wanted to reselect our candidate for the next election. And the second reform was that we wanted the leader of the Labour Party not to be elected just by MPs, which had always been the case before that, but to be elected by the whole membership. And we achieved that. And unfortunately, and that in some ways that was a high point for the left. Unfortunately, the left won at the same time that Thatcher won and Reagan won. And the beginning of the neoliberal hegemony. Thatcher in Britain won not just a political victory, but won an industrial victory, particularly with the miners' strike of the mid-1980s in Britain, which really destroyed the power of the trade union movement that had been so effective in raising wages. And so it went on through a long period of Conservative government until we had Blair. And of course, everyone was pleased to see Blair elected, and he did do some good things. But also, he preserved the theory of neoliberalism. He never challenged it. He never shifted the people, the electorate, to the left, because whilst he did some good things, his rhetoric reinforced the prejudices of neoliberalism and the theory of neoliberalism. And it was only the legacy of that party democracy, that we still had some little bit of influence, some ability to fight back, to preserve the hope of renewal of the party, that kept us going through all of those decades. And in 2010, we had a new leader, Ed Miliband, the son of Ralph Miliband. I don't know how many of you know of Ralph Miliband, who was a great critic of parliamentary socialism. But Ed Miliband meant well but failed to deliver. And it was only 2015 that we came to the point of being able to mount that challenge with Jeremy standing. And so what we did was we started that campaign not knowing that we would win, not thinking we would win. We wanted to build a new left organization, to create a database of people with which to organize in the future, to recruit people to the party, to break the consensus on austerity. But we did not know that we would win until we had this amazing response from people who were excited by what they saw as new politics. We were inspired by Sanders, but they were inspired by someone answering questions directly, honestly, and saying that austerity was not a necessity, it was not inevitable, it was a political choice made by people with the intention of improving the prospects of a few people against the interests of most people. By the middle of that summer, it was clear that we could win. Every wave of new recruits who joined to vote for Jeremy Corbyn were more pro-Corbyn than the last range. We noticed that. And so, that's how we won. We created a mass party of over 500,000 strong that was representative of the population. You know, before that, I used to go to meetings, and I'm 62 years old now, I was still the youngest person in the room, quite often. Now, and at that time, the biggest, if you look at the cohorts of age through the party, the biggest cohort were people in their 50s, and then people in their 60s, and then people in their 70s or older. Now, the biggest cohort is people in their 20s, right? Then, okay, people in their 50s, but then people in their 30s, and then 40s, and then people under 20. So we have a party that represents the population, that is diverse. Perhaps not as diverse as it needs to be, but nevertheless diverse. However, then the trouble began when we won. From the very first week that Jeremy was elected, members of Parliament, who by and large opposed him, attacked him. There were attacks in the media. And so Momentum was launched. We were preparing to launch an organization, but we were forced to launch it before we were ready. We didn't even have a constitution. But we had to defend Jeremy Corbyn against those attacks, which we did. As it happens, at the end of the leadership campaign, local groups had sprung up of their own accord across the country. And when Momentum was launched, they changed their name from Rotherham, or whatever the name of the town was, for Corbyn, to Momentum groups. And so we had groups across the country. We had, in London, we had enormous numbers of volunteers coming into an office, and that's how we launched. Our long-term aims at that time were to democratize and change the party, to support the development of left policies, to plan to defend and elect Jeremy Corbyn, and to plan for the succession and the long term. We were in it for the long term, not just for there and now to defend Jeremy, but for the long term. Above all, we thought, I'd had lots of experience of trying to organize left organizations in the Labour Party, and one of the things that kills off the left so often is the sectarianism of small differences, our tendency to have rows about small differences between us. We were very keen to avoid that. We therefore wanted to concentrate on the things that we agreed on. That led us, when we did manage to introduce our rules, we modeled ourselves actually on Podemos. I'm not sure if it's the right structure for a political party, but I think it's the right structure for a pressure group within the political party. So we had a strong centre of people who were elected by one member, one vote, or electronically online. We have local groups that are pretty much autonomous. They're allowed to do their own thing. It's their responsibility to decide what they should be campaigning on in their areas. And initially, we avoided dealing with policy. You know, we accepted the policy program of Jeremy Corbyn. We didn't get too involved in it because it would divide us. We wanted to resolve our policy differences in the structure of the party. So, how did Momentum evolve? We're now 4 years old. We have 40,000 members. Last year, we had a turnover of over £1 million. We have 25 staff at the moment. But it was a painful birth without rules. We had tensions between the large number of volunteers and our initial staff and the elected political leadership. We had tensions between people so we had tensions between the center and the local groups, each wanting to struggle for power. We had tensions between people who saw primarily Momentum as a factional organization that needed to win control, and people who wanted to build a social movement. And it's hard to build a social movement. You have given us Greta Thunberg, but starting that movement is much harder. And you cannot do it, in many ways. It rises organically because people are angry, or people are scared, or people need to campaign for their own sakes. So it was hard, developing the culture of the organization. But we knew that we wanted to develop a new kind of politics. And nothing unites us like a common enemy. And so when they launched a coup against Jeremy Corbyn in 2016, and when we had to fight a general election which was forced upon us, we came together. We could organize rapidly. In the coup of 2016, 150,000 members of the Labour Party were banned from voting because we didn't have control of the national executive of the party. We fought cases in court, which went to the Supreme Court in Britain. We managed to recruit about 100,000 of people to pay £30 just to vote when they'd already paid to join as members and for sometimes £50, but weren't allowed to vote. In the general election of 2017, when most people thought we were going to be really badly defeated, we achieved the biggest turnaround in popularity in any general election campaign in British history, from 27% at the beginning of the campaign to almost 42% at the end of the campaign. We didn't win. We didn't win a government, but we did deprive the Conservatives of a majority. And that's why we have been able to hold the Conservatives at bay from the worst effects of what they were trying to do. Now, what Momentum did was to build, firstly, a digital organization. The database that we had was the root of our method of organization. We had to navigate the legal regulation of the use of data. We had to ensure that we could collect and use that data. We had to learn about the people on our database. We had to identify what works, what you can get them to do, and what is effective. We did that by trying things, by testing. You send out a fundraising email, you can send out 3 versions, see which works best to a small sample, and then you do it to everyone. And you can do the same for mobilizing people for political activity. And so we've developed a paperless organization. The second priority was to create an organization that could mobilize large numbers of people for different purposes, for politics, for internal selections or elections, for all of these purposes, for responding quickly to events. We developed digital tools. So we have mass interactive texting, which allows one person to simultaneously communicate with maybe 100 or 200 people using text on a spreadsheet. We developed, we now use in a sophisticated way Facebook targeted advertising. You can use these techniques for internal, we use them for organizing delegates to go to conference. We use them to organize delegates on the floor of the conference during the conference proceedings to react to what happens. We use them to mobilize people for general election campaigns. We use them to canvass people to see which way they're going to vote in an internal election or a public election. So we have developed many other techniques which I won't go into because of time. Communication, we have developed social media in order, social media is enormously important to our mobilization. We produce videos, which in the last general election, one video was seen by 13.7 million people, all the way through, that is. That is key to our organizing. We have encouraged political debate. At Labour Party Conference, we organize a festival of debate and fringe, which attracts thousands of people. We have debates on all policy issues under the sun. They're wide-ranging debates. We invite the right, we invite the far left, as well as people within the Labour Party. We want to encourage debate. We don't have votes at the end, so there's no argument. There is just debate, calm debate, which is very, very exciting and intriguing. If ever you come to Britain, I would urge you to come to one of those. The relationship between momentum and the leadership is complicated. We are obviously sometimes torn between the aspirations of members and the needs of the leadership. The leadership which has a hostile group within Parliament. It has needs, and so we are caught sometimes between the two. And we are now a mature organization with the problems of a mature organization. And we know that having avoided policy in the past, in the future we cannot continue to do it. So we have to change more. Now I want to finish up by talking about how the party has changed. The problem was, we elected Jeremy Corbyn to a party that had 30 years of authoritarian top-down control, most importantly under Blair and Brown in the 1990s and noughties, the first years of the century. We had no proper governance overseeing the party structure. We'd had 30 years of the right having a career structure which took students out of student politics, and if they had the right politics, or as I would say, the wrong politics, they were given jobs, working for members of parliament, working for local government, in the amongst the political salaried posts that there are. And those people populated the bureaucracy of the Labour Party, of local councils that were Labour-controlled, people who work as researchers or advisors, people in think tanks, people who work for trade union research departments. And we have not had experience. The left had been excluded from all of that. We had too little experience of either managing the party or in government. And so we did need to win control from the bottom up. We needed to win, first of all, the local party structures, to get delegates sent to conference so that we could take over conference. We needed to get people to apply for jobs in the party bureaucracy, which was initially very unpleasant work. You were surrounded, if you got a job, you were surrounded by people who didn't want to work with you, who didn't want you to be there. Even joining the local parties was sometimes a difficult experience. So we had to have that factional battle, and we had to counter the effects of having to have that factional battle, but with good communications and positive messaging from momentum. We needed to democratize the party because our strength was with the membership, not necessarily always with the trade union leaders, not with the National Executive Committee at that time, though now we do have control. Not with, we had much internal opposition. Democracy was not necessarily as valued by people. Does that work? Yes. Democracy was not necessarily as valued by people at the top as it was by people at the bottom. People sometimes around leaders like to maintain their own power. Trade union leaders are not necessarily so keen on spreading power amongst the party grassroots. And in the Labour Party, our trade unions, and I'm very, very supportive of our trade union involvement in the Labour Party. It's very important, in my view, to have that organic connection with mass working class organizations. But sometimes, they do deals with each other. They form a solid bloc, and when they form a solid bloc, they have half the votes at our conference, and we are divided between left and right. So democracy is it's not easy to win the argument for democracy, and we've got much more to do. We had to change the party culture, and we have done so, trying to turn it into a party which campaigns all the year round in workplaces, in communities, not just at election time. We wanted a member-led policy process, but we haven't yet got it. In the 2017 election, the manifesto was written within the leader's office. It was a very, very good manifesto that everybody liked, but we have to move, for the future, to move towards a system where we have a policy process that engages all of our members. That's what our members want, and that's what we need to have to secure the future of the socialist component of the Labour Party. And finally, we have to win elections. The party machine is still weak, and we still have some divided parts of it politically. And so momentum will still play a key role in the election that we now expect in only a few weeks' time. But I have to conclude with a message, which is we haven't yet won. We have not just won the next election, but we haven't yet won within the party. The battle goes on, as it does for all of us. The far right has been strengthened in Britain. You can see that we now have our own Trump in Boris Johnson, I'm afraid. The far right, through switching the debate to nationalism, divides people and divides our supporters. And Brexit has been a nightmare for the Labour Party and for Corbyn to find a path through. And so we have lots of challenges. We need the solidarity of our comrades across Europe and beyond. But also, I think we do bring a message of hope that you can transform a party which many people have thought had been lost to socialism. You can transform it and make it very successful, though it has not yet won. Thank you, comrades.
I'm going to open up for questions. Okay, thank you so much. I have many questions, but I want to let our mötesdeltagare, our participants here to have the opportunity to ask some questions directly to you instead. So if you have questions, please wave with your hand, and I will pass you the mic. I know that we have a question here from the first row. So we can start with.
Hello, everybody. My name's Eric. Thank you, John, for an excellent presentation. Very, very inspiring. You mentioned briefly the challenges ahead for Momentum and the party. Would you like to talk a little bit more specifically about them? You know, democracy, mobilization of members, and also party Momentum leadership. And also, I think I would like to ask you about the opportunity to change a party without or with the movement and mobilizing the movement members, so to speak. Would you be able to change the party without them?
Thank you so much. Okay, so you can start with those questions.
Okay, well, can you change the party without the members? Absolutely not. You know, what we had in the Blair years was we had a career structure. You know, I described it a bit. You know, you take people out of students and they work their way up, and at every stage they rise if they're on message, if they support the line that the leader wants. That's what happened. So, you know, we're dealing with a power structure in which so many people now have salaries. You know, actually, one of the worst places is in local government, because Blair, when he was Prime Minister, he also restructured our local government in his own model. You know, in his own. So we had strong leaders in local government. We now have elected mayors, directly elected mayors, who are really accountable. Okay, they have elections periodically, but they have no, you know, every 4 years, but they have almost no checks and balances on what they do in between. We have strong leaders in all local authorities now who appoint their cabinet ministers, who award salaries, their cabinet members, who award salaries to lots of people who are elected on the local government. And so when it comes for their own re-election, it's a problem. We had recently we had a reselection of a mayor in a poor, deprived borough in London. He'd been leader of the council or mayor for 24 years. And the selection committee that was overseeing that process had 6 members. 4 had salaries awarded by the mayor, and the other 2 were married to someone with salaries awarded by the mayor. As you can see, that wasn't a very democratic process. Fortunately, it was run again, and he lost. So, you know, it actually takes member power. You know, members have to be able to choose the policies on which they fight. They have to choose the politicians who argue for them, and the politicians, in my view, has to be accountable to them. You know, one of my great regrets was I was approached because of my involvement in campaigning for party democracy in the Labour Party by members of Syriza before they were elected to government in Greece. I don't wish to criticize the government of Syriza too much. They faced a most enormous obstacle. But also during the course of that campaign, they lost most of their members who were disillusioned with some of the successive moves. And I think had they been more responsive to their members, maybe they wouldn't have won their battle. But I think they would have kept their members. And that would have been better in the long term for the left in Greece. So
without active members, it wouldn't have been possible to change the party.
Correct.
And to change politics.
And so, you know, if you're looking forward to our challenges, that's why party democracy continues to be absolutely critical. You know, we still haven't completely democratized our party. We have a long way to go, and so we must continue that. Because the problem is that, you know, at the point that Jeremy Corbyn goes, I hope it'll be in 10 years' time in his second government, but, you know, we don't know that. You know, at the moment, we would have a challenge finding a left candidate enough signatures to get them onto the ballot paper. We got Jeremy Corbyn onto the ballot paper because no one thought he would win. They won't make that mistake again. So we have to have a more democratic process so that we can guarantee that it is possible for us to continue. And actually, we need to be able to continue under a leader that isn't our choice of leader as well. We need to be able to survive and argue our case within a democratic party.
Okay, we have another question in the back.
Hello, thank you. Why, during all these years, have you stayed within the Labour Party, and why is there like and how have you motivated, as Momentum motivated new members to believe in change within a party rather than from outside? Is there a threshold where you would see yourself or the movement opt for another alternative? And you know, how is that discussion within the group on how to strengthen the group from within or from without the Labour Party?
Well, I can tell you that I did stay throughout that time. But there were periods when I was completely demoralized, and it was a struggle. And the only reason I stayed is because actually the alternatives were even worse. And it was the least bad option. And partly that's because of our electoral system, which you know, really reinforces the 2 biggest parties. And that's fine if those parties are broad parties. But you know, so you take, for example, the Greens in Britain that maybe have 10, you know, in the European elections where we do have a proportional system, they have maybe 14% of the vote, but they only have 1 out of 650 MPs. And so, there wasn't really an alternative, actually. And so we stayed there and we fought, and fortunately we had some democracy that we'd won in the early 1980s, and that enabled us, for 20 years we slowed down the rolling back of left successes. And even after that, we occasionally won victories because of that internal democracy. So, it is absolutely important. Have I covered the question? I think it might have been different had there been proportional representation. That is an issue that is still there in British politics, and so we might introduce it, and that might change the party structure. But I think, what attracted hundreds of thousands of people to the party, and particularly the young, was they did, for the first time in their lives, see politics as something which might actually make a difference to their lives. And our commitment.
Yes.
And our commitment is not just to a better government, it is to a transformative government that will transform the British state and the British economy in a way that is as near to irreversible as possible. One of the great successes, and I don't often pay her compliments, one of the great successes of Margaret Thatcher was to achieve a fundamental shift in the balance of wealth and power in Britain. Unfortunately, it was towards the wealthy. And she did it by privatization, by allowing people to buy public housing, the public housing in which they live, which most of them, of course, could not afford, but a few got a big windfall. And a lot of people, they sold public assets cheaply, and so people who bought them made some money. And so what Thatcher did was she created a political constituency which ensured the irreversibility of those changes to the benefit of the few. What we have to do is to make fundamental changes which create a political constituency that is for the benefit of the many.
Thank you. We have another question from the back. Yeah, this is the last question.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating lecture here today. I really found it interesting you were talking about the struggle inside the Labour Party yet today, and I've been following the development in the Labour students with big interests, and it's fascinating. Here in Sweden, we're struggling a lot with lowering working class support for the Social Democratic Party, and more and more often I find ideas that are closely mirroring the ideas of the Blue Labour movement in Great Britain. Local communities, lowering immigration and stuff like that as a solution to those problems. And I think that you are probably more used to those ideas than for me, for instance. So what kind of answer would you propose to lowering working class support? And what kind of answer or experience do you have with the Blue Labour movement in Great Britain?
Okay. First of all, I think we have to think about what we mean by class. In Britain, I think very often people think of class in a cultural way, but actually, it is no longer a difference between blue collar, and hasn't been for some time, a difference between blue collar workers and white collar workers. People who work, lots of people who work sitting at desks now have no job security. They have very low wages. They are sometimes on 0 hours contracts. They have a very poor quality of life. They are atomized in a way that makes it very hard for trade unions to organize them, so they have little experience of trade unionism in many places. But they are all part of the working class in an economic sense. People who work for us for a wage, in my book, are working class people. Now, unfortunately, it is hardest to win back or retain the votes of working class people who have been let down by successive governments of both parties, including the Labour Party under Tony Blair. You know, and unfortunately, they are open to the attractions of the far right, and that's what's happening. That's why we are in Britain losing votes to the far right, to Nigel Farage and co, who you will have heard of, in former mining areas, because all of our pits are shut. In, you know, where we used to have steelworks and where we used to have chemical plants. You know, all of those industries where we used to have plants or factories with 10,000 people working at them no longer exist. The biggest employer, I think, in Britain now is Heathrow Airport. You know, and middle-class people, by people who see themselves as middle class, also now are finding that digitalization is making their jobs, you know, not so very different from the jobs of people who work in call centers, who have to, you know, who are, you know, managed, you know, like they were machines. And you know, they may be better off, but they are losing in real terms too. Their children who expected to be able to come out of university and own a home like their parents, because in Britain that's very common for the middle classes particularly, can no longer do so, because when they come out of university, they have the equivalent of a mortgage, they have massive debt to pay for the fees, and they still can't afford housing because it's so expensive. So I think we have to redefine what we mean by class, but class, you know, class politics is precisely what Jeremy Corbyn has been advocating. The many, you know, for the many, not the few. It's about class. There are many components of class, and of course, black and other minority ethnic people, migrants, women, and others are more disadvantaged than white people, white men. It's true. And so we have to embrace those people, and we are trying to do that in the structure of our party by having autonomous black and women's and disabled and LGBT organizations within our party.
So thank you so much for sharing your lessons, your experiences, sharing your strategies, and inspiring us. And thank you so much for supporting Swedish social democracy and supporting us. Here is a rose, a symbol for social democracy. Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Solidarity.
Solidarity. Thank you.